This is Danielle Wood. I want to welcome you to our speaker series. I'm very pleased to introduce Alison Hobbs, a professor at Stanford here in American history, and her talk entitled Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story? Hamilton and the Restaging of America's Past. Alison is an associate professor of United States history and the director of the African and African American Studies program here at Stanford. She is also the Klein-Heinz Family University Fellow in Undergraduate Education at Stanford University. She's a contributing writer to TheNewYorker.com and a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, The Guardian, and Politico. She's appeared on C-SPAN, MSNBC, and National Public Radio. She served on the jury for the 2018 Pulitzer Prize in History, and she was honored by the Silicon Valley chapter of the NAACP with a Freedom Fighter Award. After Alison's talk, we'll have a Q&A where you'll be able to ask her some questions. We'll take a few live questions, as well as some questions from the Q&A. So during the talk, please remember to raise your hand in the participants area that you can see at the bottom of your screen and submit a question using the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And now I will very happily turn it over to Alison.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for such a generous introduction. And thank you so much for this opportunity to speak about Hamilton. I'm thrilled to be here. And I want to say a special thank you to Patricia Hall and Nicole Birkin and Danielle Wood and the Stanford Summer School team for all of their hard work in arranging this talk. It's really a joy and a pleasure for me to have this opportunity. So thank you all so much. I am going to go ahead and share my screen now so that everyone can see my slides. Hopefully that's clear. Okay, so I wanted to actually start with a personal story about the first time that I saw Hamilton, which was in San Francisco in June of 2017. And I just absolutely fell in love with this play. I became obsessed with it. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, I couldn't do anything except think about Hamilton and listen to the soundtrack and talk to other people who were equally obsessed. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out the next time that I would be able to see the play. So this is me. The first time that I saw it, I think my eyes are still a little teary from the finale. And I was able to see Hamilton. My dream of seeing Hamilton again would come true later that year in December, when I took my family to see Hamilton as my Christmas gift to them. So I became so obsessed that I decided that I wanted to teach a class about Hamilton. And I contacted several of my colleagues in the history department and around the university, and we ended up teaching the class twice. We taught it once for undergraduates and then once through Stanford's continuing studies program. And as a finale to the class that we taught through continuing studies, all of the students got to see the play because it was being performed in San Francisco at the time. So that was very special. So my near obsession level kind of frenzy and fever with Hamilton stemmed from my fascination with American history, and particularly with African American history, with the history of gender and sexuality, and particularly with these questions. One, how do stories about the past get told? How do we tell stories about our past? Who gets to tell those stories? So who has the power and the right to tell those stories? How and why do we tell certain stories and not others? Why do we focus on certain stories and not others? And why do some stories become cultural sensations like Hamilton? And why do others garner far less attention? So I really became very interested and very fascinated by this question about storytelling, which I think Hamilton does so well. What are the secrets behind great storytelling? What are the secrets behind making history come alive? And how does history often reflect, or how does the storytelling about history often reflect the particular moment that that story is being produced in? So Hamilton, as many of you know, garnered an extraordinary amount of attention before it even arrived on Broadway. This musical phenomenon was called one of the greatest artworks of the 21st century. In the fall of 2016, sales of its cast recording and advance tickets for shows began to break records. Hamilton had tens of millions of dollars in advance sales, and tickets were sold for over $1,000 on the resale market. The play would go on to win 11 Tony Awards and a Pulitzer Prize for drama. And according to Forbes, Hamilton has garnered over $1 billion in income from ticket sales on Broadway, in London, and around the United States, as well as through the cast recording and merchandising. The cast gave a special performance at the White House, and First Lady Michelle Obama called it, quote, the best piece of art in any form that she had ever seen in her life. The show's composer, lyricist, and star, Lin-Manuel Miranda, won a MacArthur Genius Award and has received universal acclaim for this Broadway sensation. Miranda has often spoken of his love for hip hop and his belief that hip hop music was the most natural form to tell Alexander Hamilton's story because Hamilton, the man, was so prolific. First writing his way out of poverty in the Caribbean, then writing his way into George Washington's good graces, and then into beats with other founding fathers and defending the creation of the country through the Federalist Papers. Miranda wanted to erase the line between musical theater and other genres of music to show that musical theater has always been an art form that incorporates many styles of music. As Miranda explains, musical storytelling has no limits. And for this reason, Miranda writes that he likes to throw every genre into it. And that is also what allows for the deep emotional and human connection of storytelling, and particularly of the storytelling in Hamilton. So there is so much to say about Hamilton. As I mentioned, I was able to put together an entire class on Hamilton. And there are also so many questions to ask about why this musical has the impact that it has had and why it has become such an enormous cultural phenomenon. So I'm going to try to formulate some answers to these questions in my talk today. But I also want to focus on what Hamilton means to us in our current moment. How has the reception and the response to Hamilton changed in just 4 short years, from 2016, when it debuted on Broadway, to 2020, our current moment, when it came back into our lives as a film last weekend over the 4th of July. So as film critic for the New York Times, A.O. Scott, explained, Hamilton pulls you back into into 2 distinct time periods. The people on stage in their breeches and brass button coats belong to the New York of 1776. But the Hamilton that we saw last weekend, the film, which played with the relentless energy and charm of Lin-Manuel Miranda, also belongs to the New York of 2016. Filmed in front of a live audience at the Richard Rodgers Theater in June of that year, the film, while not a documentary, is nonetheless a document of its moment. It evokes a swirl of ideas, debates, dreams, and assumptions that can feel like an artistic expression of Obama-era ideals around progressive, interracial, and multicultural patriotism. Casting Black and Latino actors as the founding fathers and their allies, the show's argument, woven through songs that brilliantly synthesized hip-hop, show tunes, and every flavor of pop music, was that American history is an open book. So the argument of the film and of the musical is that American history is an open book and any of us could write ourselves into it. Continuing with this idea that Hamilton, the film, documents in 2016, A.O. Scott writes that Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury and an architect of the American banking system, was Miranda's chosen embodiment of this belief. Hamilton was an outsider with no money and scant connections who propelled himself into the center of the national narrative through intelligence, talent, and raw ambition. Of course, Miranda shares some of his hero's drive and intelligence and turns Hamilton into a model of modern American aspiration. Just like his country, as he sings, he's young, scrappy, and hungry. The tale of his rise fuses individual striving and collective struggle. But Hamilton doesn't just measure success in personal terms. That is, in fact, his nemesis or his frenemy, Aaron Burr's great shortcoming. Burr scrambles after power and prestige without taking a risk or committing himself to a principle. Hamilton wants to make his mark by making a difference. Self-making and nation building for Hamilton are aspects of a single project. Hamilton is a brilliant feat of historical imagination. The show is able to bring about long dead, legend-shrouded people to life, vividly and sympathetically. The close-ups and camera movements in the film version enhance the charisma of the performers, adding a dimension of intimacy that compensates for the lost electricity of the live theatrical experience. The Schuyler sisters have some of the best numbers and also do a great job of kind of undermining the patriarchal great man tendencies inherent in this play, and we'll talk about those in just a minute. Miranda weaves the story of revolutionary ferment and the subsequent partisan battles of the early national era into a story about courtship and love, marriage and friendship, and adultery that all have their own political implications. Angelica Schuyler, the oldest of the three sisters, is a free thinker and feminist, constrained by the narrowness of the options available to women of her time and her class. Her sister, Eliza, who marries Alexander, is saved from being reduced to a passive, suffering figure by the emotional richness of her songs. Now, despite the exquisite choreography, the enthralling story, the exceptionally talented cast, there are still faults to be found. And this was particularly hard for me to accept because I loved Hamilton so much, and I really didn't want to think about its shortcomings. But as I read more about the play, I found that historians and other scholars had many critiques of Hamilton when it was still on Broadway. And these critiques have come into even sharper relief now in 2020, as much of America is reeling from the multiple tragedies and crises that have occurred this year. As one critic writing for The New Yorker explained, quote, "The righteous multicultural patriotism of the play seems now at odds with the strident call of the Black Lives Matter movement for radical change to an America where the legacy of white supremacy lives on." In addition to demanding an end to anti-Black violence from police, many protesters have focused on removing or toppling various statues and monuments of Confederate leaders, as well as Andrew Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt, Christopher Columbus, and even one of Abraham Lincoln. So some eyebrows were raised when Lin-Manuel Miranda and Hamilton's producer, Jeffrey Seller, admitted in late May that they were guilty of the moral failure of not speaking up about the protests in response to George Floyd's murder. And while there has been at least one report of the use of a Hamilton quote, "History is watching," at a Black Lives Matter protest, to reassess Hamilton now is to note what some scholars have described as a crucial incompatibility with our current moment. Its hero and its message are essentially ambivalent about slavery and racial equality, while today's racial politics requires taking a much stronger stance. Indeed, Hamilton is a minefield of mixed messages. Is our takeaway about Hamilton the man that he is a revolutionary hero or a flawed philanderer? Is its strategy of non-traditional casting a triumph that allows people of color to rise up? Or are they undermined by the irony of how their embodiment of founding fathers ignores the fact that most of the characters they play were slave owners? The problems of slavery aren't ignored altogether, but slavery does have a way of slipping to the margins. Jefferson's ownership of slaves is cited by Hamilton during one of the cabinet battles, but Washington's doesn't come up. And Washington, also from Virginia, was just as embedded in the system of slavery as Jefferson. Miranda crafts Hamilton as an immigrant who gets the job done, as an outsider. But Hamilton, in reality, faced none of the discrimination wielded against immigrants that he is drawn as a model for. For example, he had an elite education at King's College in New York, paid for by a trading company in his Caribbean island of St. Croix that had dealings with the slave trade. Hamilton's own curious ambivalence: he had married into a family of slave owners. He thought that Black people's natural faculties were probably as good as whites, and he believed in a version of democracy that was largely based on hierarchy and monarchy. None of these ideas are revealed in the play. Instead, we are given a picture of Hamilton as an abolitionist, as someone who was anti-slavery, and someone who was dedicated to the fight against slavery. Now, even though Hamilton possibly found slavery objectionable, he compromised that belief to protect property rights. It was this kind of compromise that created a semblance of national unity, but buried the issue in an American myth about egalitarianism and racial equality and democracy that still plagues us today. This ambivalence of Hamilton in the play is camouflaged by the love story at its center that also seems to be at the core of the play's appeal. First, Hamilton's romance with Eliza distracts our attention from the fact that the Schuylers were one of the largest and most notorious slave-owning families in New York State. In fact, the Schuyler name was so scandalous that last month, the mayor of Albany ordered the removal of a statue honoring Philip Schuyler, Hamilton's father-in-law. Indeed, for the Schuyler sisters to be as lovely and as desirable and as beautiful as they were involved the labor of several slaves in tending to them, helping them to prepare for the balls that they regularly attended, including the one where Alexander met Eliza. A similar bit of camouflage is carried out in the scene where Hamilton has an extramarital affair with Mariah Reynolds. The distracting hand-wringing over his betrayal happens as he is engaged in debates over the ratification of the Constitution. The story focuses on his desire to create a central bank to assume all debts created during the Revolutionary War. The drama over Reynolds glosses over Hamilton's failure to speak out against the 3/5 compromise, which allowed Southern states to count Black people as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes. Now, with regards to gender more broadly and to some of the other flaws in the play, one critic has argued that the play fails to pass the Bechdel test. The Bechdel test asks whether a work of fiction features at least two women who talk to each other about something other than a man. And this may seem like quite a low bar, but in fact, there are many works of fiction, many television shows and films and plays that do not pass this test. This test is often used as an indicator for the active presence in film, the active presence of women in film and other fiction, and to call attention to gender inequality. With regards to Hamilton, some critics argue that the female characters simply do not get enough stage time. And when they do appear on stage, their desires, fears, hopes, plans, and narratives exist only in relation to Alexander, the man at the center of the musical. Even the show's most overt feminist interventions fall short of satisfying. Consider, for example, Angelica Schuyler's crowd-pleasing, revisionary recitation of the Declaration of Independence in the song The Schuyler Sisters. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, but when I meet Thomas Jefferson, I'm going to compel him to include women in the sequel. Now, unfortunately, these lyrics are then followed by, look around at how lucky we are to be alive right now. Though one could argue that this line exhibits the sisters' excitement to be living in revolutionary times, such a lyrical celebration tellingly displaces the show's most overt feminist critique of that same revolution. Namely, that white landholding men and not white women would be the beneficiaries of the revolution and would enjoy equality in the new nation. And since the musical is not entirely accurate in depicting our founding fathers, and given all of the cross-racial casting, why wasn't cross-gender casting considered? Though Miranda does offer an admirable amplification of Eliza Schuyler's historical contributions, particularly if we think about the last song, this move seems to be a little too late and a little too little for this male-dominated musical. Isn't there so much more about the history of women and the history of gender that this musical could have explored? Perhaps one of the most powerful critiques of Hamilton has come from historian Lyra Monteiro, who questioned the understanding of the show as racially progressive and unpacked the casting strategy to ask why no historical people of color, no real men and women living during this time found a place in the narrative, acknowledging that the show had the power to interest the broader public, including children, in the history of the Revolutionary era. Monteiro asks, is this the history that we want most Black and brown youth to connect with? One in which real Black lives are not visible? Why not show some of the real Black people who were involved in the revolution? So while the play has certainly acted as a positive vehicle for the exposure and the success of Black actors, the emphasis on the white founding fathers effectively erases 14% of late 18th century Black residents who were mostly enslaved in New York and for whom such high power positions were unimaginable. Now, scholars have also raised a concern about the casting, that the supposedly colorblind casting has been deployed as a way to buttress the credibility of the project. Scholars have argued that despite how many actors of color there are on stage, that this is still essentially white history, and that no amount of casting can disguise the fact that real life people of color have been erased from the actual narrative. Indeed, some scholars have argued that in Hamilton, the fact that white men that founded the United States, colonizers all, and slaveholders some, are played by men of color actually obfuscates histories of racial violence in the United States. So case in point, Cabinet Battle #1, where the very talented Daveed Diggs argues as Thomas Jefferson for the security of the South's slaveholding economy. The actor's Blackness visually distances his performance of racism from Jefferson's whiteness, enabling a largely white audience to forget the degree to which they are implicated in the violent anti-Black histories of the United States. The success of Hamilton is also striking because it opened on Broadway about a year after Holler If You Hear Me, a play loosely based on the life of Tupac Shakur, one of hip-hop's most authentically political figures. And this play actually flopped miserably. Hamilton's triumph then could be seen, and some scholars have argued that we can see it, as evidence that Broadway audiences were not so much seeking a musical about hip hop, but rather were looking for a version of hip hop that privileged a white liberal audience by allowing them to embrace Blackness on their own terms. Now, with all of these critiques, is there a chance that we will just never be satisfied? Are we being fair to the artistry of the musical? Would we hold white actors or producers or writers to the same standards? Would white writers be expected to do all of the work that we want Hamilton to do? I think it is important that we do critique Hamilton. I think that the critic, perhaps ironically, must be like Hamilton himself or like Angelica Schuyler. The critic, all of us, must, quote, never be satisfied. We can and we should demand the best from Miranda and from all of our brilliant cultural producers. We can and we should demand that the musical theater stage the revolution we need, that the musical theater materialize and make visible with its unique magic the just world that we all deserve and that we all want to see. So let me end by saying that it's always good to have these kinds of debates, that perhaps one of Hamilton's greatest gifts to our culture is that it sparked a very important conversation, a critical conversation that crosses disciplines and that may stretch on for many years or decades, as has happened with all the great playwrights, Shakespeare, Eugene O'Neill, Arthur Miller, Tennessee Williams, and many others. Hamilton is motivated above all by a faith in the self-correcting potential of the American experiment, by the old and noble idea that a democracy and a more perfect future can emerge even from a history that is riddled with contradictions and that includes violence, injustice, inequality, and slavery. The optimism of this vision is undeniably inspiring. But it is also heartbreaking, especially in our current moment. Its central questions, including who lives, who dies, who tells your story, are staring us in the face right now. It is understandable that in our current moment, in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, which has clearly identified systemic racism and police violence as deeply embedded in our past and our present, that Hamilton might seem almost quaint or too ambivalent. We are now in a moment when America is not satisfied with ambivalence or compromise, but yearning for real and necessary change. Hamilton reminds us, both now in 2020 and in 2016 when it first debuted, that America is unfinished. It is an ongoing project, that our democracy is contradictory and fragile. While we should rely on our cultural producers to provide an image of the democracy that we hope to achieve, it is our job, perhaps one of the most important jobs that we have to do, to fight for that democracy. Thank you so much, and I'm more than happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Alison. That was so powerful. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the chat right now so that everyone can just show your gratitude for our speaker today. And we will go ahead and begin the question and answer portion. I'll take a question from the Q&A. So, are there going to be any other classes that are offered at Stanford on Hamilton, maybe in the fall?
That's a great question. So right now, we don't have plans for a class on Hamilton for the coming fall, but I think that it would be really terrific to offer a class on Hamilton, especially in light of the film being released last weekend. And now Hamilton is much more accessible than it's ever been. I mean, one of the main critiques of Hamilton in the past that I didn't talk about, but that many scholars and many cultural critics have discussed is just how expensive it was to see Hamilton and how that made it kind of prohibitory for many people to go see it. And then also that it was only staged really in major cities. So now that people can see the film, it is much more accessible, and I think it would be great to have a class about Hamilton now that students can see it much more easily. And I also think that it would be very interesting to talk about it in the context of this current moment, to talk about the ways that it maybe, and we can certainly talk about this more in the question and answer in this period, about whether or not it does resonate or does not resonate with this current moment, whether we are in a very different moment than we were in 2016, and what that means for the play. So I think that it would be really interesting and very thought-provoking to have a class now about Hamilton where we really could consider just how different this moment is. And then we could sort of think about how much Hamilton was a product of its time, and what that means for its future reception. Thank you for that question.
And our next question comes from Andrea. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute, your microphone and ask your question.
Hi, yes. I don't know if this is maybe off topic, but I was just going to ask your personal opinion or your personal interpretation of the final gasp of Eliza at like the very end of the show.
That's a great question. And there's been so much debate about the gasp. And I think that it really depends on how the actress performs it. I think if you see different actors perform that gasp, it sort of seems to signal different things. So Lin-Manuel Miranda has been very kind of close-lipped about what he wants people to take from that gasp, because I think he really wants people to kind of imagine it in whatever way they choose to. So I have read that some people think that it's Eliza dying and going to heaven, and she's sort of gasping at the beauty of heaven. Some scholars have suggested that she's reunited with Alexander at that moment, and she's gasping at seeing him again and being reunited again. I personally really like the idea that she is stepping out of she's sort of stepping out into our world and seeing the audience, seeing these audiences that are sold out, and seeing that her story is actually being told. So I really like the idea that while there are many criticisms about the role of women in Hamilton, one thing that I think is really important to think about is that the play ends with Eliza. The play ends with Eliza's voice. It ends with her story. It ends with the fact that she lives 50 more years. It ends with us finding out all of the things that she does, all of the ways that she brings this history of the Revolutionary era to life. Interviewing all of the soldiers that fought by Alexander's side, working to build the George Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., reading and publishing Alexander's papers. And then, of course, most importantly to her is that she builds the first private orphanage in New York City. And gosh, I'm such a fan of the play that I'm almost tearing up just thinking about thinking about the finale. So I think that the gasp to me is Eliza seeing that her story is being told, that she is part of the narrative, as she says in Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story. She says, I put myself back in the narrative. I stopped wasting time on tears. I live another 50 years. So I think it's that she sees that she is a part of the narrative. Yes, this play is about Alexander Hamilton, but it is also about Eliza Hamilton. And when people leave the theater, they are leaving with her story and her contributions and all that she gave to American history. So that's my personal take on it. My personal take is that I think it ends on a kind of strong feminist note about all that Eliza contributed.
Thank you so much. All right, so our next question comes from Sophia. She asks, how do you think Hamilton would have been perceived if the cast was not made up of people of color? Would it have been as popular?
I don't think it would have been as popular at all. And you know, one way of thinking about this, and I wish I had this slide in my presentation, is if you look, so before Hamilton went to Broadway, it was performed at the Public Theater in New York. And before they kind of came up with this image that you see here on the screen, there was another image that they used, which was a picture of Hamilton, the man. And it just is somewhat flat. It doesn't have the same kind of energy. It doesn't have the same kind of power. And I think that part of what makes the play so universally loved is that by casting people of color, it allows us to kind of reimagine the revolution and to imagine what could have been possible, what our country, I mean, it feels like it sort of helps us to imagine the ideas that our country was founded on, even if they were just ideas, even if we are still struggling to live up to them and we are still struggling to realize them. And I think that you wouldn't get that if the actors were not people of color. I think if the actors were not people of color, you also would not get the same kind of authenticity in terms of the music, the choreography, some of the music and the choreography that is based in hip hop or based in R&B. I think that would be kind of disjointed and wouldn't really, I don't know how well that would work. I think there would be kind of like a difficulty for the audience to really kind of absorb that without feeling some kind of disjointedness. And I also just think that it would be harder. I mean, and in some ways this is complicated because some of the critiques of the play include that we aren't thinking enough about the fact that these founding fathers were slaveholders. And that's something that by casting Black actors, that's something that sort of gets erased or sort of papered over. But I think if these were white actors, then we would certainly have to deal with the history of slavery, which in some ways we could argue would be positive because it would force us to have a conversation about slavery, and it would force us to really grapple with the reality of our history. But in another sense, I just wonder if that would complicate the play in a way that would make it sort of somewhat unwieldy in a way. And not that I think that would be a very good thing, but I don't know if I don't know if it could still be as popular if it dealt with the real history. I don't know if people would kind of enjoy it as much as they do if slavery was a larger piece of it.
Thank you for that. And it's kind of a segue to that topic. We have our next question. Are playwrights artistically or morally required to be historically forward-thinking and actively adapt the show, even a show that is embedded in a specific era like Hamilton, to the modern standard of political correctness? So basically, are artists required to be politically correct in their expression?
That's a fantastic question, and I think that's something that we could really discuss. That some people would argue, yes, they are, that they have this incredible power to offer a vision and an image of, in this case, America, of the founding, of democracy, and that they have this incredible opportunity to present a particular vision that might help people to really think about the possibility of America. I think other people would argue no, they don't, that artists should be able to create art for art's sake, and that's the joy of being able to create art, that you can create whatever moves you, and that you shouldn't necessarily be responsible for being politically correct or for fitting your vision of the kind of art that you want to make within any framework other than your own. So I think that's a great question, and something that people would have very different opinions on. I mean, I think one thing about Hamilton that is very interesting is that part of the reason why there has been so much criticism and so much adulation of it really speaks to how many people it reached. It speaks to how invested people feel about Hamilton, and how much weight people put on Hamilton to kind of carry a number of different stories. So that would range from the people who say, oh, there should have been more about slavery, there should have been more about racial injustice, there should have been more about racial violence in the Revolutionary era. Other people will say there should have been more about women, there should have been more about patriarchy, there should have been more about the ways that women were not the beneficiaries of the revolution. And I think that that's all wonderful. I mean, I think as an artist, I would imagine that sort of your greatest gift, your greatest contribution, your goal is to spark exactly these kinds of conversations. It's to put something out that is inspiring and exciting and entertaining and interesting, and then to let people go at it, to let people have questions, and to kind of wrestle and grapple with these ideas.
Thanks. So this is a kind of a creative question from Maya. If you were to write about Black revolutionary characters and put them into the show, who would you feature?
That's a great question. So one thing that I think I would do, because of my interest in African-American history and also in gender history and women's history, I would love to see a character like Hamilton's mother. Rachael Hamilton, I think was her name. So, all we know about her is that she died, an awful death. Aaron Burr repeatedly refers to her as a whore. She was left by Hamilton's father. We see that in the very first scene. So I would love to know more about her story. What is her story? Obviously she's more than what we get from, that very first scene and from the few times that Hamilton describes her. I would love to know more really about Mariah Reynolds. We don't get that much about her either, except that she has this affair with Hamilton and that she's in an abusive marriage and she's trying, we don't quite know exactly what's going on with her and her relationship. So I would love to know more about her. Certainly Sally Hemings would be a fascinating figure to have in this play. There is a moment in the song "What Did I Miss" where Jefferson says, "Sally, be a lamb," and put something on the table for me, or bring me a letter. I think he asks her to bring him a letter. And so there's a nod to the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, but obviously there's been so much incredible scholarship on Sally Hemings, and Monticello is now doing so much more about bringing her story into the public view at Monticello. So I would love to see more about Sally Hemings. And then I would also just love to see, throughout the play, you have the women who are dancers, who are part of the cast. And I think my guess is that they sort of represent kind of the sort of public, and we don't get much of them at all. Maybe a few of the dancers have lines, but I think it would just be very interesting just to see, if there was someone who was just a woman of the time, maybe not even a famous woman of the time, but just, a woman living in the late 18th century, to learn more about her life. And then of course there are a number of Black soldiers who fought in the Revolutionary War, like Crispus Attucks. So there are, many stories of Black people and women who it would be very interesting to know more about their stories.
Thank you. And we have one last question. So it's from Liliana, and she asks, is it okay to enjoy Hamilton? And if so, what is the best way to enjoy it? And I think that's on everyone's mind, which is why I saved it for last.
I think it is absolutely okay to enjoy Hamilton. I think it's okay to let people know that you liked Hamilton. I don't think that it has to be a secret. That was the one thing that I was really struck by when I was working on this talk for today, how different my talk for today was from when I taught the class in 2017. And how in 2017, it was such a celebration of Hamilton, and it almost felt sort of mean-spirited in a way to critique it. It almost felt sort of like I was being petty, almost intellectually petty, by bringing up these criticisms of Hamilton. But I think that a really important message that I would want to leave you with is to say that it's always good to ask questions. It's always good to look at something from many different angles and from many different perspectives. So we always gain more. Sometimes we gain a deeper appreciation of something, of Hamilton or of any cultural product, by interrogating it and by asking these questions about, well, what kind of perspective do we get on women? Or what kind of message is this sending about race or inequality or, any of these really important issues? And I also think that we get a really important, we learn a lot by thinking about how this relates to our current moment, and in recognizing that, right, there may be some discordances with our current moment, and there may be some kind of discontinuities with our current moment, but that's okay too, because that helps us to learn more about our current moment and to understand it more deeply, and in a more nuanced and complex way. So I think as students and as scholars, we always want to be sort of seeking out ways to deepen our understanding of something, or ways to complicate our understanding of something. But we also want to be able to sometimes sort of take off that student hat and to just enjoy something, and just be able to kind of revel in the creativity and the artistry and the choreography and the storytelling of a great a work of genius, the work of someone who is really the master of their craft.
Well, on that note, I just want to thank you so much, Alison, for this fantastic talk. And I want to take off my professional staff hat and just say how deeply moved I was by what you talked about and the layers you added to my love and understanding of Hamilton. I think that the sign of a really gifted teacher is that they get you to look at something you thought you knew well in an entirely new way. And you definitely did that for all of us today. So thank you very much.